People who grew up rich, when did you realize you were living in a bubble and not like everyone else? Not rich, but in high school, there was this one kid who wore the same shoes from sophomore to senior year. I kept telling him to buy a new pair, but he would claim that they were broken in and he didn't want to waste money on uncomfortable ones. I decided to do the thing where the class would surprise him with a new pair of Vans for his birthday. But when I asked our classmates to chip in, they all said they didn't have any money to spare. That didn't make sense because most of them had after-school jobs. That's when I found out I was the only kid in class who wasn't working to help support their own family. Edit, I ended up getting him the shoes on my own. I'm not rich, but things really hit home when I was with a friend and his mother started to panic because she couldn't afford milk for her toddler son, my friend's little brother. I was just walking around with $40 in my pocket for no real reason, so I gave her $20. She was embarrassed to be taking money from a 13-year-old, but swallowed her pride for the sake of her children. I knew my friend wasn't as well off, but it never fully hit me what that meant before then. To me, being poor just meant someone couldn't afford nice things. What it meant to struggle with basic necessities like milk never really struck me before then. I went to a private art school in NYC. I grew up poor and was there on loans, but 99% of the kids there were super well off. I remember they'd joke about being poor because they ate ramen noodles for lunch and bought clothes from a thrift store. It's like they had this romanticized, almost comical image of being poor. Meanwhile, their parents wrote a check for their tuition and paid the rent for their Brooklyn apartment every month. But what you said is 100% spot on. People don't realize how depressing being poor really is. It's more than just not having the latest iPhone or a huge house. It's having to boil water on the stove to take a bath and bouncing a check just to buy groceries. Living in poverty is debilitating and affects you mentally just as much as it does materialistically. People don't realize how expensive being poor really is. Everything you own is cheap and breaks down a lot. Almost any problem becomes an instant emergency because you have no buffer at all. Effectively, one loses control of one's finances, because all financial decisions are made for you. Pick the option with the lowest upfront cost, even when you know that will come back to bite you. I was talking to a friend about going to the town's public beach and they were saying how horribly crowded it gets in summer, and I suddenly realized, I was well into my 20s, that I had never had to go to a public beach because I always had at least 2 private family beaches to go to, one with cabanas, outdoor showers and space for cooking. I always had taken it for granted. Likewise, it blows my mind that there are people with private beaches like a whole section of the ocean is someone's personal backyard. So crazy, it must be such an interesting way to live, honestly. Edit, your username is perfect. Here in Oregon, you can't own a beach. You can have an oceanfront beach house, but you don't get to stop people from enjoying the beach in front of it. And that's how it should be everywhere. I have a family member that grew up with a private jet. The first time she flew commercial, she turned to her family and asked, who are all these people on our plane? On flying, I'm no way rich, but I was reading that the majority of the world's population, over 90%, didn't take one flight last year. I'm not sure if that's true, I'll look for the post, but that hit me pretty hard how fortunate I am to fly to see family sometimes. Who are all these people on our plane? Wow. That's pretty detached from reality. Age isn't given. Pretty normal question for, say, an 8-year-old in that situation. When I went to college and had friends who were complaining about student loans. Same here. I remember when I started seeing a girl at uni and she said she had loans. I asked her why she didn't just ask her parents for money. Grew up a lot that day. I was a couple of payments behind on my tuition, so my account was flagged on hold. I needed to pay my tuition in order to register for next semester's classes. I didn't have all the money, so I called my school's Office of Student Accounts to try and work out a payment plan. When I asked the lady on the other end if I could set something up to remove the hold because I couldn't pay it all at once, she asked, "Why don't you ask your parents for the money?" She must have enjoyed a wonderful life. I was about 12, I think. When friends would come over, they would go on and on about how big the house was and how I had more games and computers and shit than them. They especially seemed freaked out about the maid, and I just started to realize that I didn't have the same circumstances as most. They wouldn't all say it if it weren't true, I assume. I did have other friends with money, especially when I started attending private school, but I didn't realize they were well off either. When a school friend came over and asked, "How many families live here?" and it was just our house. I was 8, and I was embarrassed. My in-laws had some friends visiting who brought people from Ethiopia over. At my grandmother-in-law's double-wide mobile home, they were amazed that just one person lived there. Wasn't rich per se, but my stepdad was a djinn and made tons of money from it, so I came from a very wealthy family, but I realized I was living in a bubble the day I moved out and went to college when I was 18. My buddy and I got an apartment and I got my first job to help pay for it. I soon realized what it's like to be living paycheck to paycheck and that not everyone has just excessive amounts of cash they can throw around, lol. I have a rich friend and he found out he was rich when I asked him why he buys a new car like one every 2 months, slightly exaggerated. Him, engine light was on. Me, and they couldn't fix it. Him, fix it? I thought that meant it's broken. I just got a new one. I had to explain to him that normally, people get their car checked out first when something's wrong and only buy a new one when the repair costs more than the car. Now we know who populates all those low-mileage certified pre-owned cars. I wouldn't call my family rich by US standards, but upper middle class, so rich by world population standards. My dad grew up super poor, so he made sure we understood how lucky we were. But to be honest, I didn't really understand until my teenage years when he took me to Costa Rica to visit where my older brother had lived for a couple years. We didn't go to the beach or touristy spots, and I got a much better idea of what poverty can look like. It made me really appreciate the luck I had being born into the family I was born into. I try to keep it in mind as I go through life, and hope my kids learn not to take their luck for granted either. It's a pet peeve of mine when people are born into wealth and act like their own wealth is 100% from their hard work. Sure, they may work hard, but never discount how much easier they had it than others born into poverty. I worked to pay for my undergraduate degree, but if I hadn't been able to one semester, my parents could have bailed me out. I don't know if they would have, but knowing they could have made it substantially less stressful. Greater than it's a pet peeve of mine when people are born into wealth and act like their own wealth is 100% from their hard work. This is crucial. I don't mind that you're rich, but don't pretend you hit a home run when you were born on third base. More upper middle class. Since I started using Reddit, especially reading AskReddit posts, I've been realizing more and more every day how fortunate I am. Same here. Makes me really appreciate my parents. They're not perfect, but they beat a lot of these other parents by a lot, and they care a ton. Sometimes too much. The first time I met other kids who didn't have domestic household staff, I remember not understanding why they didn't have people to maintain their household. This is a pretty typical answer to the various versions of this question we see on Reddit. Did you wonder who looked after the household staff's households? Conversely, I remember a summer where me and my mom lived in a car and I thought it was the coolest thing. Turns out we were just homeless. Meanwhile, in university there was a guy who didn't understand why we didn't all have our own condos right by the school. He also never understood why we didn't have money to go to Mexico on reading break and would just tell us to ask for a bigger allowance from our trust. He learned to just stop talking after someone fed him a left hook when he made a comment about how stupid we are for taking out student loans and not just paying tuition up front. I overheard one of my older brother's friend tell another friend, "Because we're not rich like your spoiled fucking ass. You might have more money than me, but we all look down on you." I actually felt bad for the rich kid before I got old enough to understand what a cunt he was. "You might have more money than me, but we all look down on you." Goddamn, what was his reaction? This isn't a great response because I didn't grow up rich, but rather very poor. I feel like I should share though. I met my first best friend in grade 6. When she brought me to her home I was flabbergasted. They had a vacuum that plugged into their walls, they could even vacuum downstairs with it. She had a trampoline and Xbox. I begged each time to play with both. She had a small alcove with a mini fridge that was full with ice pop and different sodas. That was cool. I remember thinking I should take more than one because I wouldn't get another chance. When they invited me over for dinner, her mom always made me take extra because I was nervous to ask for seconds. I couldn't believe the amount of food in the house, and we all would have a huge glass of milk with dinner. Milk was always a treat, and being able to drink as much as I wanted was so overwhelming. I just remember being astounded by everything, and 3 years later they adopted me. It sounds like you were able to get out of a bad family situation into a better one in the most positive way possible. Define growing up rich. My dad didn't start making real money until I was at least 10 or 11. We were comfortably middle class before that. I guess it started when we moved to a new city and people in my school would openly ask/tease me about being rich. I think the first thing I started noticing was that we took a big annual family vacation, usually on a plane, while many of my friends have never flown before. Lol, this is literally me. My parents were comfortably middle class when I was little. We were well off. I had a bucket or two of toys, and every 2 to 3 years we might go on vacation somewhere. I'm just starting to realize now how my younger brothers have had drastically different childhoods compared to me. My parents starting making a lot more money around when I turned 10. My youngest brother has a room dedicated to toys. We go on vacation every year now. It's just weird to think about. This hits home. My dad had a small business he ran out of the basement when I was little, and while we were pretty solidly middle class, we weren't rich. I was 12 when he sold the company, and suddenly we were very well off, but I stuck to my middle class spending habits. My little brother, on the other hand, became real spoiled. In college I happily bought my pair of jeans at Walmart the same year he bought 2 $750 pairs of designer jeans. Since then, it's only gotten worse. He now threatens not to come to family events unless my parents pay shell out for luxury accommodations, while I happily take the blow-up mattress in a basement. My uncle was in a famous rock band. We didn't have a ton growing up, but whenever I went to my uncle's it was always super fun with all the toys and snacks he'd get me. He wasn't crazy with his money. His favorite restaurant was the Waffle House, but his home was on the beach, nice cars, etc., so I recognized the wealth. It wasn't until I was like 8 years old that I realized not everyone was related to a celebrity. He died a couple years ago and my heart still hurts. I did not grow up rich. But my husband did. His sister once said I didn't know everyone didn't live in big houses until I went off to college. Apparently she led a very sheltered life. Oh, this reminds me of a geography excursion in high school. Context: I went to a private school on a scholarship. We created a scoring system for urban areas, things like the availability and condition of public infrastructure, roads/parks/street lighting, and ways to think about the housing stock in different places, size/upkeep, etc. We then went to the wealthiest suburb in that city, where some people rated the area just 57/100ths. We then went to a more standard middle to upper middle class suburb, a lower middle class suburb, and a very much poor suburb. People got quieter and quieter. Whereas they ranked down the wealthy area for a single piece of trash, they were forced to confront that some areas didn't have amenities, and the windows on the homes were covered in newspaper. And even then, this isn't the US, the magnitude of poverty wasn't as large given the social safety nets. Frankly, it was a brilliant exercise on the part of that geography teacher. Incredibly brilliant. Not the same, but similar. In first grade we did an exercise for 2 days that basically emulated black and white segregation. Our teacher made a point to split up the best friends in the grade into the 2 separate groups. I remember so clearly that there was an automatic shift in the grade between the good kids and the bad kids. For a day the good ones sat in the front, got the good crayons, got to use the new water fountain, and lined up first for lunch. The biggest shift to me though, was how our class acted towards each other. The good kids were able to sneer and snigger at the bad ones, and got away with it. Even on the playground, the kids that wouldn't normally play together were playing their own games and the bad kids huddled around each other and just sulked. It was a fantastic lesson, and one I still remember 12 years later. I do hope she continued that lesson. I grew up middle class. When I was in 5th grade I spent the night with a girlfriend. In the morning I remember asking what was for breakfast, and I remember seeing my friend's face. I then realized the kitchen was literally empty. The dad came in and gave us a small package of those small white donuts from the gas station, 4 in the package. I felt so embarrassed that I asked. We had a great day hanging out, but I learned what poverty was that day. I remember reverse pickpocketing my best friend's dad. I remember I got a $50 for my b-day one year and I put it in his wallet while I was over at their house. Never said anything about it. OFC, knowing my friend's dad, he probably bought a homeless guy lunch with it. But I never did find out anything about it. In terms of raw cash flow, my parents were never rich, they were just teachers. However, they were international teachers, so I got to see and do things many people have on their bucket list by the time I was 18. I definitely had a very privileged upbringing, if not a rich one. I was kinda aware of it, but it never really hit home till my first year living back in the States, where people just didn't know about so much of the world. Greater than where people just didn't know about so much of the world. Apparently you've never been on People of Walmart. I grew up upper middle class. Not private jet rich, but definitely was able to enjoy life's luxuries, nice vacations, newer products, etc. Honestly, I think it was the small things that were a lot bigger for other people. I never really cared much about the price of a meal. I simply ordered based on whatever sounded the best. Add on some sides? Sure, why not? Same thing with driving. I always volunteered to be the driver on long trips because I never really thought much about swiping my card for gas. Just fill up and go, no need to check my account. I definitely realized in college that a lot of people didn't have that privilege. The first time I went to my best friend's house, his circumstances were the exact opposite. His parents tried their best, but his dad often didn't have much work during the winter, and his mom didn't work outside of the home. They had 6 kids, and usually had things like pancakes for dinner. I'm in an upper class part of DC, with every toy and electronic imaginable, and he had none. It was a good lesson for me to learn, but it was a shame that it was at the expense of a person I loved so very much. I was in your friend's position growing up, and now my kids are in your position. I'm hoping my kids learn how well they have things comparatively. Are you still friends with that person? Unfortunately no. He went missing shortly after our high school graduation. His car was found on the side of a little used stretch of road. The car was still running. The driver's side door was open, and his wallet was on the front seat. His parents had him declared dead about 7 years later. I was broken for a while, and I think I kept in contact with the detective working the case for updates more than his own family did. It sounds like you may have grown up similarly to how my parents did. They lived in poverty when they were kids, but had more money than they could spend by the time I came along. I benefited a lot from their sweat. When I started talking in school about the pros and cons of Disney World versus Disneyland, and people were like, "You've been on vacation. Lucky E." What are those pros and cons? Asking for a friend. Greater than Disneyland is smaller and easier to navigate, especially if you're taking small children. It doesn't feel quite as overwhelming. Disney World on the other hand has so much stuff. It can be super exhausting to try to do everything. I learned at 21 that people have water meters. Some people actually put money into the side of the box and get water and electricity like pay as you go. I'm not rich by any means, but I realized how privileged I was that day, and I haven't taken anything for granted since. Thumbs up. Hey, 21 is better than 80. Our old retired neighbor complained to my mom that someone was walking across her yard and peeking through her windows. She assumed they were looking through the windows. The tracks in the snow went straight to the water meter and back out. When I stopped being well off, we were upper middle class and had a very large nice house in a fancy part of town. Had a pool and all that. We took regular trips to Cancun or Jamaica etc. I had every toy I ever asked for the most part, and nice clothes. I was very spoiled as an only child. My parents divorced and their money got split in half, and so we no longer had the money to live in that neighborhood or have a house that big or fancy. My mom could not afford to buy me designer or name brand clothing anymore. Money got tighter. I started getting made fun of by my former friends for not having nice clothes or things or living near them. Former friends dumped me. Turned me from Regina George into a loser, I guess. It was a hard fall. Reading AskReddit threads where people talk about the things they ate or went without as a kid. It was always foreign to me that ramen was an actual meal for some people and not just a quick unhealthy snack. Having grown up poor, it surprises me how many people regularly ate ramen. That was a special treat at our house. My parents bought rice by the 50 pounds bag. Rice for dinner every night and free school breakfast and lunch. I wasn't on the free breakfast track, but my family ate rice for dinner multiple nights a week. Along with a few Depression-era dishes like chipped beef on toast. Lots of scratch-made biscuits. I didn't think anything of it. But, during the time my mother was working her way through a degree. Right around the time I graduated from school, and I'm their youngest, my dad's career had started to take off. My mother's career in accounting even more so. As soon as all their kids were gone, they started actually making money. Now they have a freaking pool. I didn't really notice until I was older that I had a somewhat privileged childhood. We always went to Europe for vacation, we owned a second home on Cape Cod, we belonged to a country club, I took golf lessons, went away to camp, played traveling league hockey act. Now I'm not able to provide quite that level of lifestyle for my own kid, and it's something I have a problem with and deal with in therapy among other things. I am in this position. I grew up with one, sometimes two trips to Disney World. Any game or console I wanted, $1,000 Christmas, the being wealthy lifestyle. I am now 25, working in IT for almost minimum wage, and I am wondering how I will pay for my kids' Christmas and pay bills. I live less than check to check. My kid is happy and I never let our struggle show to her. But I am studying my ass off for more certs to further myself. Just trying my best to stay happy without electricity a couple days a month. Edit, 1 or 2 trips to Disney World a year. Like big, stay in a suite on the resort trips. I've looked into pricing and I can't fathom how much it costs for those trips. Not rich, but upperish middle class. I went to a play date when I was 10 and his mom was single and they lived in a tiny apartment. I couldn't figure out why he didn't have a house or a dad. Sad to say, I was so uncomfortable that we didn't stay friends much longer after that. Sorry Darren, you were a good dude and I was dumb. My friend was like that. For a while she lived in a 2-bedroom apartment and shared a room with her brother. It took me a while to realize that they just didn't have a lot of money. I know some people like this where they think they are out of the bubble, but never ate ramen noodles for 3 months to survive. I don't think they will ever realize what it's like to live without a blanket of financial security. I mean, you don't know what it's like to walk miles and miles each day for fresh water, not knowing whether it will be available or not. I think the biggest difference people can make is trying to learn about other people's struggles and situations. Even the most privileged of us have problems, and sometimes the poorest of us are the happiest. The best thing we can do is try to understand, befriend and support the people around us, and the people we come into contact with. It's far from that simple though. When my dad bought me a house to live in rent-free, no mortgage, and realizing that most people don't holiday in the Algarve twice a year, my house is now a hostel/safe space for anyone I am friends with/close to who needs a place to stay. How I know I didn't grow up rich, I had to Google Algarve just now. Wasn't rich but realized I was far better off than I was led to believe when I tried filling out FAFSA forms to go to college. My mother freaked when I told her I needed income information. Turns out, she'd been lying about our financial state for years and didn't want to see any of that money spent on college for any of her 5 kids. I found out that we were far poorer than I'd believed when I finally convinced my dad I needed our tax info to fill out the FAFSA. He was straight up refusing to give it to me for a while. FAFSA is absolutely fuckery. My parents made enough money to give me $15,000 a year or something, but I never got to see a penny of that. When I went to my friend's house when I was about 8, that was the first time it sunk in that 15,000 square feet houses weren't normal. Holy shit, 15,000? That's not a house, that's a mansion.